Do you really know how to say no? And why should you be able to? Today, we'll look at one of ancient Greece's most controversial philosophers, one who really rebelled against society, and how his example can be good for us. Today's Classical Wisdom Speaks podcast is with Mark Usher, the Lyman Roberts Professor of Classical Languages and Literature, and a member of the Department of Geography and Geosciences at the University of Vermont. Mark has also recently published a book with Princeton University Press called How to Say No, of which we'll be speaking about today. But before we begin, a quick reminder to check out classicalwisdom.substack.com for our free newsletter and articles. You can also support our mission to help promote and preserve the love of history, philosophy, and mythology by subscribing either here on YouTube or on our website. Now, on to the cynics, who've had much more influence than you might have known. So I've just been enjoying reading your book, How to Say No, which, of course, the title captures the attention and makes everyone think of their toddlers not needing to read it. And I'd love to kind of get into the ideas of it and kind of who what your translations you have and the segments. It's really interesting. But before, maybe we should just get right into the premise, which is why we should say no in the first place, and what is the importance of being able to do so.
Great. Well, questioning premises is the reason why you should say no. You should say no, comma, and then ask the question. And that's what the Cynics did in their entire lifestyle. You know, there's so many things in the world that the pressures that we have to conform without thinking, or to play along without really thinking about why or whether, or if it must be so. So the Cynics really kind of questioned the very basic premises of everything around them. And so you're right on to ask me that. So, you know, think about it. I mean, we're asked from early childhood to just go along with the way things are, because if we don't, things become troublesome, problematic, makes people uncomfortable. You know, gosh, you could have a revolution if things, you know, played out fully in society. And, you know, human beings tend not to like instability. And they also tend not to, you know, critique received ideas. So I think the Cynics are, you know, I think the Cynics are especially important now than ever, because we get so much information. There's an information age that comes at us from every which way, like this medium that we're doing right now. And so much of it is disinformation. And, you know, if we ever needed critical thinkers and people saying no, comma, but what about, it's now. And so the Cynics are models of that, and not just kind of hypothetical ones. They lived it. You know, they lived that questioning of received ideas. And that also was inspiring to people in antiquity, and I think can, you know, inspire us in some ways as well.
Yeah, it is really amazing to think that we're in a period of needing to question things a bit more. I couldn't agree more. But I do wonder if we want to be teaching our children how to say no, if that's going to be probably problematic, or maybe equally, do we not already know how to say no? Do people really need to be trained to say no?
I think people do need to be trained to say no. I think people say, I mean, I'm an academic, and my colleagues are saying yes to all sorts of things I don't think that they should be saying yes to. People want to be team players. They don't want to, you know, have the appearance of being troublesome or making waves or having a contrary view. You know, some people are by nature contrarians and they're annoying. Cynics may have been that sort of, you know, type of person, but you know, we don't do it enough. And when you say, like, you know, children, you're right, they naturally say no. I mean, it's sort of built in, they're kind of hardwired. And I think to see the world as a child might see it could do us a lot of good. In fact, before I wrote this book, I don't know if you know, I wrote a children's book about Diogenes, where he's cast literally as a dog. And the reason why I did that is, well, A, because the dog story is such a fixture in a children's world. It's a genre of illustrated book, for one thing. And the word cynic means dog in Greek, and they were called cynics because they behaved like animals out in public without any sense of shame like dogs do. And so what I did is I cast Diogenes literally as a dog, and he was a dog who wanted to be his own master. He was nobody's pet. He was an autonomous dog in the story, and all the anecdotes, in the story, all pitched to children and all, duly sanitized,
which is
were
necessary. Yeah.
is very necessary. We're encouraging children to say, well, yes, question the things around you. I mean, it may be a little inconvenient in the grocery store shopping line, when you're in the checkout line where, the children saying no, 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 and throwing a tantrum. But there's something childlike about the cynics in their primitivism that I don't know, is refreshing, at least in the right context. I think we all need a dose of it.
Now, before we proceed, I think we should get into a little bit of what cynicism is, and just, the obligatory throat clearing of separating ancient cynicism from sort of the modern term, just to kind of get everybody up to speed. But also, I would love for you to talk a little bit about it not really being a philosophy per se.
Great. All right. Let's see if I can keep track of those three things. First, I just mentioned cynic is a word that means simply in Greek, dog-like. And so it was a nickname conferred on these people that were later called cynics, like Diogenes, one of the founders, certainly the figurehead for cynicism, because it was an insult, because they lived out of doors, they begged for their food, like a dog will beg. I don't know if you've ever been to Athens, but before the Olympics, several years ago, and they cleared up all the stray dogs on the street. But I mean, stray dogs on the street are everywhere in Athens, as in many parts of the world. And I think if you had that experience, whether in Athens or anywhere, you get a sense of perhaps what the cynics were about. They slept on doorsteps. They were homeless, right? They begged for their food. They did all their business. When you're homeless, what do? You do all your private business out in the open. Now, the cynics did this in a kind of curated kind of way. They did it on purpose. It was voluntary poverty. So, and it was to make a statement. So anyway, they were called cynics by others, but then typical of cynic self-effacement and cheekiness and sassiness in general, they adopted it as a badge of honor. They said, yeah, I'm a dog. And Diogenes then there's a whole slew of anecdotes associated with this where Diogenes says, yes, I'm a dog because I beg from those who give, I bark at those who don't, and I bite the bad people in town, like a stray dog. So modern cynicism is quite different. So, and it sounds like the cynics are just doing that to just be misbehaviors and cause trouble and draw attention to themselves. Maybe, kind of, but their point was serious. And they said, they basically argued through their lifestyle and the things that they taught and believed, their ethics, let's call them, that one can change one's behavior. It doesn't have to be the way it is. You can do without. So, for all the people who pursue luxury, say they need this, they need that, they need the other, Diogenes would say, no, you don't. No, comma, you don't. And I'm living proof of it. So they kind of made a point to act out that sort of thing. And so in that way, they're optimists. They believe that you could change and that human beings were capable of, how about this, perversely, human beings are capable of much less or to be happy with much less than you think that they are. So their less is more philosophy was what they're about. Modern cynicism is quite different. Modern cynicism, sort of that word as we use it, lowercase c, captures the other side of the cynics, having always sort of a witty, supercilious thing to say about something, judging people, being aloof, having a bunch of critique but no answers, no solutions. The Cynics, they had all that, but they also, again, put their money where their mouth is. They didn't have any money, but they lived their what they preached. They lived what they preached. So and because they believed that human beings could change, I think they were optimists. So they weren't like modern cynics at all.
I do like though when reading your book to see all of the the sarcasm and the biting comments and the clever quips. I mean, one of them I was thinking was very funny when I was getting ready. I was like, oh, I shouldn't put earrings on, because there's that great line where it's like, oh, the poor ears of women today, they're just burdened by so many pearls. And
Yeah,
it's a delight to read, in a way.
right.
It's a lot
Yeah,
of fun.
that's Demetrius, the cynic that lived in the age of Nero. He was a friend of Seneca's. That passage in the book is actually a nice example of like what might have been a typical street sermon that a cynic would deliver once he got going. So, you refer to many of those exchanges cynics had with other people, passersby on the street, the rich and powerful, but also the regular Joe, were kind of banter, witty one-liners back and forth but they also were known for, giving full out, Hyde Park sermons, right? Harangues on topics. Our word diatribe, you've heard, that word comes from sort of this genre that the cynics were masters of, that they would be able to just go on and preach about all the woes of society, probably in a humorous way. The one from Demetrius that you refer to is a touch sanctimonious, but again, he's living in Rome. He's a Greek, but he's living in Rome, and Romans were different than the Greeks. The original Diogenes was much more, sarcastic and witty for wit's sake, almost.
Yeah, no, and the banter is, I mean, it's fun. You could see like Jane Austen enjoying it or something like sometimes. But for my third part of my question that I sort of threw at you to so many, was it wasn't really a philosophy though. That was something I sort of had a misconception about.
Right. Right. They're kind of cast. I mean, yeah, we think of them and they're in introductions to ancient Greek philosophy. They're kind of cast as philosophers, but they didn't have like a formal set of doctrines that you needed to subscribe to, or it wasn't so much, particulars of teaching that one had to come to terms with in order to be a cynic. It was definitely a lifestyle movement. So they were lifestylists and they were performance artists. That's not to say that they didn't have teachings, right? I mean, they believed certain things. They believed to do without is better than to do with. And they believed in what they called askesis, which is a Greek word that means training or practice. And they borrowed the term from the world of Greek athletics. So askesis means training, and our word, modern word, ascetic, comes from it, though it's come to mean something a little different today, but it means doing without, to kind of put yourself through rigors. So like lifting weights, you're stronger at the end of it, or on the treadmill, right? You're able to endure things or whatever comes your way when you need to. So the idea of building up your strength. And so they were moral ascetics, where they train their bodies to say actually yes to their mind, which is saying no to convention. So that was part of their shtick. As you can tell, that's kind of a way of life. That's a way of life approach to living in the world. And to that degree that they are philosophers, because most philosophies in antiquity were, philosophy was a way of life, an alternative way of life to the way most people live their lives, but it just wasn't founded on specific doctrines. In fact, one thing when people said about cynicism was that it's a shortcut to virtue. And what they meant by that, it was kind of a little bit of a critique of Stoicism to say that. So if you were a Stoic, there was a whole bunch of things you had to believe about human psychology, about the way the world is, about providence, about, philosophical, veridical propositions that you kind of had to come to terms with or internalize or believe in a way. Cynics weren't so much about that. They were more like, let's just cut to the chase, live virtuously, live simply, and radically so. And so the idea of it being a shortcut to virtue means you don't have to study physics to become wise.
It's like ancient virtue signaling, maybe.
Maybe, yeah. I mean, they were definitely virtue signalers, though it was a very different kind of signal that they were sending than what normally counts for virtue. I mean, as you probably gathered from reading so many of the anecdotes, one of the things that I love about Diogenes in particular, and it relates to the question that you asked about, were they a philosophy or were they a school? There are several in the tradition. There are several encounters of Diogenes with Plato, and Plato. I love Plato. All right, and he was also a believer in philosophy as a way of life, and he also put his money where his mouth was. But he was a very doctrinal thinker. He had a lot of ideas, and they were hard won. And he thought that we should think critically about things, and what is truth, come to terms with it. Anyway, but these encounters or sometimes confrontations between Diogenes and Plato, probably most of them fictional, arise from the fact that Diogenes stood in sort of opposition even to established philosophy. So Plato represented like the typical stereotypical philosopher, sitting high and aloof on the cloud, thinking great thoughts, and Diogenes gets the better of him. And in one encounter, I just love. So Plato spends, he's in a lecture hall surrounded by adoring students and fans. And he comes up with this very sophisticated definition of the human being as a featherless biped, in thinking in sort of philosophical categorical terms. And then Diogenes, who's been sitting in the audience, so the anecdote says, comes in with a plucked chicken and says, "Behold, Plato's man," right? Plato's human. To which the anecdote says, Plato got all flustered, and then he added to his definition, "with flat fingernails." So the idea is that Plato's trying to save every appearance to kind of save his reputation. Diogenes does a simple act of bringing in a plucked chicken. I mean, that's like how funny is that? That's like slapstick comedy, textbook slapstick comedy. Bring in the plucked chicken. Diogenes does it to make a point. That syllogistic logic and that sort of over taxonomizing of the world doesn't do anybody any good. Just live a good life. Live the virtuous life is kind of the message behind all that. Anyway.
Well, no, but I think it's wonderful. I think it's important too that we question all of these great thinkers, and it's something I like to remind people when we're studying the classics, that even in their own time period they're being questioned. Like, we should never hold Plato as the utmost. We're supposed to constantly having a great conversation and a dialogue with these thinkers as they were doing in their own time period. And that's one of the things I think is a great reminder in Diogenes' story, that he questions even Plato, and so should we. Sometimes Plato's going to say stupid stuff.
Absolutely. And I have to just say, for the record, the real Plato would have loved to have a Diogenes character in his dialogues. In fact, I have to say this, all right, of all the people who followed in the wake of Socrates, Socrates is sort of the patron saint of philosophers, and everyone looked to him as like, the philosopher, capital P. I think the Cynics were the closest to Socrates in terms of just manner, lifestyle, approach. They were always questioning. They were, Socrates himself was like more or less homeless, walked around barefoot, was a parasite on other people's goodwill, hung around, talked, loved dressing down important people. And that's what what got him such a following. I've always thought the Cynics kind of follow in that, closer in that tradition than certainly a Plato does, at least as a philosopher, as a thinker, or Aristotle and company.
That's a great insight. I think you're right on that. But as you mentioned, they didn't write anything. So what kind of sources did you use for your book?
That's actually a more interesting question than you think, because, all right, so obviously secondary, people who wrote about the Cynics, and they had many admirers as well as detractors. So the sources reflect, both of those sorts of camps. So in the book, one very important source is a compilation source by a guy named Diogenes Laertius, no relation, no connection to our Diogenes the Cynic, who wrote lives of famous philosophers from antiquity and, cataloged anecdotes about their life, included, lists of their writings, summarized their teachings. It's kind of gossipy. It's kind of, the world would be poorer if we didn't have it. It's not itself reliable. Diogenes was dependent upon other antecedent sources in compiling this compendium. And so there is a life of Diogenes, quite long one, full of the anecdotes that I translate in the book about these encounters that Diogenes would have with people in the street. That's one major source. But the Emperor Julian wrote a couple of. He was the so-called apostate emperor who, in the Christian period, became a turncoat and wanted to revert the whole empire to paganism and pagan philosophy, i.e., non-Christian philosophy, the old classic philosophy by that time. And he wrote a couple of treatises about Cynicism, even though he wasn't a Cynic himself. He was a Neoplatonist, Pythagorean kind of character, thinker. Seneca writes about Demetrius and about Cynicism, so he's in there. Lucian, I mentioned. But what I should say is that because the Cynics were such outlandish public characters and influencers, and they became sort of memes of their time, it became a school exercise for students to write, to make up good Cynic anecdotes that would be believable, true to life, and compelling. As practice on being, practicing creative writing and being persuasive and being witty in your own writing. So many of the anecdotes that we have about the Cynics are these sorts of exercises. They were called crai, plural, or crea in the singular, usefulisms. I want to call them usefulisms. They became serviceable little bon mots that you could sprinkle your sophisticated discourse with, of your own composition, and you would write them as practice for doing them, even perhaps extempore, so that when you're at a ancient cocktail party, you could come up with a clever thing to say, on the spot, because you had practiced composing them. So anyway, a lot of the anecdotes we have about Diogenes are these kind of things, and it raises the whole question of, did they ever happen? Did Diogenes ever say them? And my quick and ready answer to that always is, it doesn't matter, because the legend that Diogenes inspired and the fact that the game that these students were assigned to play was make it as realistic, believable as possible, means that Diogenes was certainly something like this. And a copy is always inferior to the original. I'm speaking, like a Platonist, but the notion is that Diogenes was probably really better in the original. So because they didn't write, we're reliant upon secondary sources, but we shouldn't worry about that and shouldn't fear, really, because same thing as with Socrates. Socrates didn't write anything. All we have is what Plato says about Socrates and what Xenophon says about Socrates, really. So that notion that, Plato was trying to capture the mystique of Socrates, these anecdotes and these traditions, legends about Diogenes are also trying to capture that, that thing that really the real Diogenes really had. And to me, that makes them just as valuable as, thank God we have them, right? Almost as good as the real thing.
Yeah, it's amazing too, because as you say, it's not really a precise philosophy, it's a lifestyle. So these anecdotes are kind of conveying that lifestyle, then that's perfectly spot on. Yeah.
Right. And also, I have to say this too, this may be a little bit too, I don't mean to be too, subtle about this, but they also reflect the reception of cynicism in and of themselves, meaning that they show how people at different times, later times, thought about cynicism. And that's just as important as what the cynics were up to in their own time, right? Because as you just mentioned before, it is a very long continuum. It goes from 4th century BCE to 6th century CE, right? 800 years. So it's nice to see how people thought about cynicism in their own times, in their transmission of it. So yeah, I think that they're important. These anecdotes are important for that reason, the cray.
Well, I must say I'm inspired putting together a kids curriculum, and I feel like I'm going to enter this as some of the activities for the kids to do. I think we should bring it back, see if we can inspire a new generation of cynicism.
There we go. Absolutely. Why not?
So I wonder, I mean, obviously Stoicism is enjoying quite the renaissance and popularity. Can we learn more from Stoicism than cynicism, considering that Stoicism is a little bit more fits in with modern life, maybe?
Right. It's more self-help than a little more self-help than cynicism is. It's more palatable. Good point. Yeah, I was on Ryan Holiday's show, The Daily Stoic, and when my other book, How to Be a Farmer, came out, because he has a small holding in Texas somewhere. But so cynicism, I mean, excuse me, Stoicism, you're right, is all the rage these days. Maybe a little bit too much so, but a good dose of cynicism could serve as a good corrective to that kind of once something becomes popular, it kind of diminishes in its not so much authority, but its effectiveness. It becomes wishy-washy. I mean, I mentioned Buddhism before. I mean, like Buddhism in America, oh, come on. It's like, might as well just read a self-help book. It's the same thing. I mean, in the way it's been diminished, right, from what it really talks about, what it really teaches. So cynicism is always kind of that spur to kind of inject, reinvigorate even some of these things like Stoicism.
I call Stoicism the great gateway drug into ancient philosophy. So,
Like
because I
that.
like bringing up skepticism. I like, bring like a lot of the pre-Socratics, a lot of these great ideas. So maybe people kind of get guided by Marcus Aurelius, like a Virgil, into this ancient realm. But I'll take it. I'll take it.
Yeah, absolutely. So you mentioned skepticism, which got me thinking. So another guy that went out with Alexander to the east out of philosophical curiosity was a guy named Pyrrho of Elis, who was the founder of skepticism. And there is no doubt that he hung out with gymnosophists too, and actually brought back in his teachings, especially about what can and cannot be known, wisdom from the East. There's strong similarities between early Buddhist teaching, classical Buddhist teaching, and skepticism. So the transmission of ideas and from one school or one even culture from the next was very alive in antiquity. It was a more interconnected world than we think. So not only Zeno influenced by cynicism, but the Cynics and the Stoics too being influenced by Eastern philosophies.
I love that. I absolutely love that. We did a really interesting webinar on Zoroastrianism and seeing that influence, and it was really fascinating. But I love that chapter of yours, the passage to India. That was a really interesting chapter, and I thought it was interesting too because the sort of counterparts were advocating for more moderation in some ways than the representing cynic, which, coming back to our previous idea about maybe moderate from within. I thought that was a good balance. Now, I want to sort of finish up a bit with cynicism today. So, as we were saying, Stoicism is enjoying its renaissance. Maybe it's time to let cynicism get a bit more of the spotlight. What are some of the modern issues do you think cynicism specifically kind of can help address?
Good question. So one, I think that has a really broad application. It has nothing to do with crazy antics or stunts performed in public to people's shock and awe. is the idea of appropriate technology. So this is a term and a kind of a movement, a concept that was invented by a guy named E.F. Schumacher, who is an economist who worked for the British Coal Board and worked in Burma and also India, was influenced by Gandhi. But the idea behind appropriate technology is that you should never use more materials or labor to accomplish something than you need to for its purpose and for the betterment of people. In other words, you shouldn't just, invent stuff because you can, or you shouldn't just have stuff because it's available. So this notion of a technology that serves its purpose, that doesn't control the user, right? An example might be in, how about like in a place where there's no electricity in the middle of the desert in Kenya, where labor is abundant, where people living in the village need the water, but electricity is unreliable. An appropriate technologist would say, let's build a very efficient pedal pump system where people can take turns, when they need water, to pedal a bike to generate the pump to bring the water up so that people can have it from the well. That's an example, a very simple, crude example of what appropriate technology is. Solar energy, wind power might count as that if it hadn't been already corrupted by corporate capitalism. But the idea is there. So the reason why I say the cynics are sort of a purveyor of this idea is that there are several anecdotes that kind of suggest this. So, they have this less is more philosophy of life. And it comes down to the nuts and bolts of living. So Diogenes, famously, the cynics had like three things. They had a knapsack, right, on their back. They had a walking stick, and in that knapsack they had a cup, a bowl / cup, maybe a cup and a bowl, where they would beg for their food to get their food, and a cup to drink their water. So Diogenes happens to be lounging around the sun one day and sees a child use his cupped hands to drink water from a fountain. And it occurred to him, he says, oh my gosh, a child has just bested me in simplicity. He's vanquished me because I've got a cup. This kid's using his hands. I can use my hands. So he throws his cup away, obviously ostentatiously, throws his cup away so everyone sees it, so that I can just use my hands. And then he sees another anecdote. He sees a child used a hollowed out hunk of bread to take his lentils in. So he gets this hollowed out hunk of bread, goes, gets his lentils, eats the lentils, eats the bread. Diogenes says, whoa, I toss out my bowl now. So this notion of like doing with as little as you need to get the job done in principle, right? We're not going to eat our lentils in hollowed out hunks of bread across the planet. But that principle can be applied in so many different ways to so many different situations. So I always talk about Diogenes as the inventor of appropriate technology.
Can I just say, from a very modern interpretation of this, until about 3 years ago, my husband and I and my daughter, we didn't own stuff. We moved back to Argentina with like 6 suitcases. But what we like doing is we like going and traveling for 6 months at a time with just carry-on. And you just pare down to the simplest things. And it is so liberating to have just like one little small suitcase that can go anywhere. And, you just liberate your mind from so much. I don't think we realize how just having a house to clean and clothes to what, and like all this stuff all the time takes away so much of our mind, our processing power that we have to, think about. And when you just live really simply and you're just in a tiny Airbnb with just your like 3 things, you're just so much freer. I always recommend go carry on only for everywhere you go, always.
Yeah, well, the cynics speak to that too. They are the doyen of decluttering. Marie Kondo, as I say in the book, has nothing on the cynics, right? They were all about getting rid of stuff you don't need. So yeah, I agree with you totally. Plus, they charge you $150 to check in a bag these days anyway, so you might as well just take carry on.
Might as well, might as well. Are there any other good cynic lessons for our modern world?
So the cynics were acutely aware, presciently aware of what economists now call externalities. So an externality is like an adverse effect that happens in the environment or to people by the production of goods and services that really aren't accounted for. They just and the cost of them are not figured into the purchase of the product or the making of the product. They're just, people who make those things, make the products or deliver the services, just let it happen to other people or the environment, polluting, all these sorts of things. The cynics were aware of this. I mean, in that harangue, that diatribe that Demetrius the Cynic gives in the book from Seneca, he points to the costs of luxury goods. Not only are luxury goods not good for you, Mr. and Mrs. Luxurious, but also it harms all the people down the line. What the costs are to acquire those goods for your pleasure are not negligible. It's a matter of life and death. So he talks about, for instance, people lost at sea or people in the mines trying to dig out gold and silver, dangerous job, especially in antiquity, usually performed by slaves. Here's Diogenes calling out people for their, externalized harm, not only the harm you're causing to yourself and to others immediately around you by your bad life choices and inappropriate values, but also all the people down the line. That to me is like in our globalized world, that's a message we really need. Related to that is also just the fact that the cynics with their less is more philosophy are sort of, I call them the gurus of degrowth. They're all about, enough already. Okay. See what you can do without, make it a challenge, make it a design competition to see how little you need for this, that, or the other. And not to market it, not to capitalize it, but to do it because it's a good principle in and of itself, especially in a world of finite resources like the one we live in with global warming and global heating, let's call it, but also because it's the purpose of things are to benefit people. So if you have that as your mindset, we can't grow unlimitedly, and the externalized costs and all this sort of stuff. So I think that speaks to the modern world too, again, indirectly, but in principle. And it's a pretty important principle, I think. One more, the cynics inspired a movement that's happening in China now. Maybe it's a couple years old now, but I'm not sure you're familiar with it, called the Tang Ping movement. Tang Ping means in Chinese, lying down flat. And some kid on social media, some 25-year-old or something, had enough of the Chinese work week and long hours of factory jobs that everyone's doing in China. I think it's called 996. So from 9 to 9, 6 days a week, you work. And he basically just said, no, no more. And his mantra was not no, it was lying down flat. And the idea behind that is like, you just stay in your bed. You don't go to work and work 12 hours a day. You just lie down flat. Or he actually, in his blog post where he announced his sort of manifesto for lying down flat, I can just sunbathe like Diogenes sitting in front of his barrel and think about, philosophy. This was the alternative to just like, the daily grind of working in a factory to make money to what? So it became a movement, and, t-shirts, people, a protest movement. So, and it definitely was inspired by Diogenes's idea. This, I think he was called the kind-hearted traveler. That was his avatar, his handle online. And he had been reading Diogenes in Western philosophy, Heraclitus too, that inspired him to kind of make this statement. Anyway.
Wow, that's amazing. Yeah, no, it's start a revolution from your bed, right?
Yes.
But it's interesting because I think there's quite a few movements like that. I've read about revenge procrastination, and as well as I think what's happening in the US is quiet quitting.
Yeah, that's a soft porn version of how to say no. Right, quiet quitting, but how to say no. Like, no, I'm not going to do that. I'm not going to. So it's a
I
version
leave
of
at
it.
5. Yeah, perfect. Well, I'm gonna end us on that, the soft porn of cynicism. And and thank you so much, Mark. And I think your book was excellent. It was really interesting, and it was a great way to sort of delve into the world of cynicism through all these different vignettes. So it was very enjoyable, but also very enlightening.
Very good. Nice to talk to you, and I look forward to seeing more of your podcast.
Thank you for listening to Classical Wisdom Speaks, a podcast dedicated to bringing ancient wisdom to modern minds.